Today, I would like to talk about 3 science fiction TV shows and movies that had an impact on me. The 3 of them are Lost in Space, Star Trek, the original series, and 2001, A Space Odyssey. The reason I selected these is not just because they had an impact on me personally, but I think they also had an impact on the whole science fiction genre. Prior to 1966 and the debut of Star Trek on TV, science fiction was mainly children's TV shows or movies. Children's science fiction like Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, Commando Cody, and others. Movies were generally low budget. There were a few exceptions, of course. For example, 1950's Destination Moon, 1951, The Day the Earth Stood Still, 1953, The War of the Worlds, and 1960, The Time Machine. It should be remembered that the 1950s was a time of the Cold War between the East and the West, between the United States and the USSR, and there was a great fear amongst ordinary people of a nuclear war. And movies and science fiction books tried to exploit this fear by producing books and movies with scary creatures that were either the result of nuclear war or because aliens came in or whatnot. The 1960s were a little bit more optimistic with the space race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were exploring space. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man to orbit around the Earth. In September 1962, John F. Kennedy gave the famous speech about trying to land a man on the moon. And it wasn't until July 1969 that the Americans landed on the moon with the famous short speech by Neil Armstrong. And this is where I come in personally. I do remember watching that on our small black and white TV. It seemed like everybody in the world watched it, and it was quite an amazing feat. So this is the context of the 3 shows that I would like to talk about. For the first part, I have created a spreadsheet, and I will use it to do a chart which will compare all 3 at the same time. So as you can see, the 2 TV shows, Lost in Space and Star Trek, aired in the mid to late 60s, and 2001, A Space Odyssey premiered in April 1968. Lost in Space was created by Irwin Allen, and Star Trek was created by Gene Roddenberry. Stanley Kubrick was the director of the film. Lost in Space was inspired by Swiss Family Robinson. It was like a Swiss family in space. Star Trek was inspired by a Western TV show at the time. I believe it was called Wagon Train, so Gene Roddenberry called it the Wagon Train to the Stars. In 2001, I believe the main inspiration was a short novel called The Sentinel about how aliens make contact with humans. But later on, I'll get into more detail. I think there are other inspirations. The budgets are estimated. I just got these just by searching on the internet, so each episode would have been radically different, but Lost in Space was like in the low to mid $100,000. Star Trek was about $200,000 per episode, and 2001: A Space Odyssey was $12 million. It took several years of pre-production, and you can see every penny of it is on the screen. The mission of the Lost in Space family is to go to Alpha Centauri, and the mission starts in 1997. The setting of Star Trek is, I believe, the whole Milky Way galaxy, and it's in the 2260s. And 2001 is a bit more ambitious. It starts with prehistory and it goes up to 2001. The mission, now this is the interesting part, I think. The missions for all three are quite different. The mission for Lost in Space is to colonize a planet. The typical concept for American Westerns is to go out there and colonize. Whereas Star Trek had a slightly different, it wanted to explore. It didn't want to colonize, it just wanted to explore strange new life and to make contact. 2001 was, depending on whose point of view, I guess, if you take the point of view of the aliens, for them it's to make contact with humans. From the point of view of the humans, it's to investigate the monolith, to find out where it's from, and to follow it, to find out more about it. The type or the genre for each of these is also, I think, quite telling. Lost in Space was more of a children's fantasy. It belongs to what I was talking about earlier, the children's sci-fi. And you can tell because it also featured the family. It was the adults of the family, plus there were two young children in the show. Whereas Star Trek, at least in the original series, there were no children, and the setting is more of a utopian, futuristic. It's not meant to be dystopic. I believe Gene Roddenberry was tired of humanity fighting amongst itself, and his belief was in the future we will have a utopian Earth, and we will send out our representatives to explore the galaxy in a futuristic sort of way. And 2001, the whole point of it is alien contact, not to give away too much, but human evolution. One way to remember the shows is by their catchphrases. Of course, the most famous one for Lost in Space was "Danger, Danger, Will Robinson." That was the robot would always would warn the boy Will Robinson of danger ahead. Star Trek, there were three of them. I guess the most famous one is "Phasers on stun." Spock was famous for saying "fascinating," and the Doctor was famous for saying, "I'm a doctor, nada," and every episode he would say something else. And 2001: A Space Odyssey was famous for "Open the Pod Bay Door, Hal." Awards. All three of them got some kind of awards. Lost in Space got a few nominations but no wins. It did win an award for the most awesomest robot. Star Trek had a few Emmy nominations but no wins, but it did win some Hugo Awards. And 2001 won an Oscar for Best Visual Effects and a BAFTA for Art Direction, Cinematography, and Soundtrack. And for those who like to use the IMDb website, these are their ratings. I believe so for each episode they might go up or down, but I think this is like overall 7.3 for Lost in Space, 8.3 for Star Trek, and 8.3 for 2001. Now I'd like to talk about each of the shows separately. Lost in Space, I only watched a few episodes as a kid back in the, not sure, late 60s or early 70s. I don't think I watched the originals on TV. It was just the repeats. It wasn't until recently as an adult that I watched the whole thing, and I thought it was kind of silly. But thinking back as a kid, I thought it was very interesting. It portrayed a very optimistic view of the future where there were robots and computers, and Will Robinson did have a lot more of a presence in the show, and he used to, for instance, fix the robot when it went haywire, or he used to work on the computer, and I thought it was very interesting, and that probably affected me, and which is why I currently have a job in the computer industry. So I thought as a kid I would give it a higher mark, but as an adult, when I watched him, I thought the science was really bad. And I should clarify what I mean. I know that there are some things in shows, in science fiction shows, where you have to suspend your disbelief. So things like having the ability to travel great distances within a few minutes, because after all, it's just a 1 hour show, and if you want to meet different aliens every episode, you have to be able to travel probably faster than the speed of light, or pretty close to the speed of light. And I know technically it's probably impossible, so you suspend your disbelief and you go along with the show, because after all, it's just an entertainment show. But what I didn't like about it was about Lost in Space was there were other aspects that were really bad. Like, I remember there was one episode where they had a person floating in space without any equipment, without a mask, without oxygen. They were just floating in space. Now, I don't know if it was meant to be like a dream sequence or if it was reality. I don't know, but it was really bad. And then the other classic example of bad stuff was where they ran out of ideas for bad monsters. They had talking plants. It was quite silly. But the interesting thing is they did have a few episodes where they try to deal with modern day issues. One of the ones that I found interesting was generation gap. We don't really talk about that much these days in the 21st century. Like, I mean, now the issues are like gender issues or race issues or gay rights or stuff like that. But back then, the generation gap was a big issue. So both Star Trek and Lost in Space dealt with it. And interestingly enough, they both had the same actor. They both had Michael J. Pollard in 1966. Lost in Space had an episode where he played a young teenager who was all alone for some reason. I don't remember, but the theme was about how he couldn't really get along with the adults, and he became friends with Penny. So that was, I thought, quite interesting. Speaking of Star Trek, so it was the same thing. I didn't watch the originals on TV. I watched the reruns. Early 70s, they were on in my city just after school, so when I'd come home, they were there. Although, interestingly enough, when I first saw them, I thought it was like a horror movie. They featured scary aliens. I didn't like it, so I didn't watch the first year or so. But then as I got a little bit older and they were still on TV after school, and I started to get interested in it. Now, as an adult, I recently bought a DVD version of the first season, and I've been watching a few of the episodes in sequence. I must say I was surprised by some of the things that I'd forgotten about. Like, early on in the first few episodes, it was quite obvious the female characters were wearing really, really short miniskirts. It's like in the 60s, miniskirts were in. TV tried to take advantage of that. But the interesting thing in the background about Star Trek was that they had not only an international flavor of characters, but they also had one alien, Mr. Spock. In the background, Gene Roddenberry wanted to have a progressive background to the characters. So I believe early on in the first few episodes, the number one character was played by a female. But once the studio executives saw that, they said, no, you can't have a woman as number one. So eventually she became the nurse. And Spock was supposed to be the very intelligent alien. But quite early on, they made it obvious that even though Captain Kirk wasn't a typical, with air quotes, typical intellectual, he could always outsmart Mr. Spock and whatever bad guys he was fighting against. Early on in the first or second episode, where Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock are playing 3D chess, and they make it quite obvious that Captain Kirk is smarter because he beats Mr. Spock in 3D chess. But it's done in such a heavy-handed way, where Captain Kirk makes a move and he declares checkmate. Whereas anybody who knows how to play chess, you know that games are never really played to the very end. Nobody really calls checkmate. You know if you're losing, and you declare a loss. It was just so heavy-handed the way they did that. I didn't like that. But on the whole, I liked Star Trek for its positive, optimistic view of the world and how they were going to explore the galaxy, meet strange new aliens every episode. And then as far as social issues, so like I said, they too had an episode with Michael J. Pollard portraying a young character where they dealt with the issue of the generation gap. And I still remember to this day, they made up a word called GRUPS, G-R-U-P-S. I thought that was very interesting. And of course, the other famous episode was the one where there were two aliens, where one was black on the left side and white on the right side of his face, and the other one was the reverse, white and black, and they were two people fighting each other. And of course, so this was at a time when TV could hardly show characters dealing with racial issues, but it was okay if they were aliens. And now I just would like to end my discussion about Star Trek with two major points. So this is the rationale for me making the video. I believe that Star Trek, its major accomplishment is that it redefined the genre of science fiction. Like I said before, everything that came before Star Trek, most everything was not very scientific, childish kind of shows. But with Star Trek, science fiction started to be taken seriously, and they could explore adult issues. Interestingly enough, though, I think the second contribution that Star Trek made was every week people could tune into the show and watch Captain Kirk sit in his comfortable captain's chair. Oddly enough, before Star Trek, people used to stand in spaceships. Most any show you watched, there'd be people standing and watching into telescopes or whatever, just flying around. They'd be standing around. Or if they were in a spaceship, they would be in the cone of the rocket, and they'd all be sitting down in the circle. But Star Trek was the first one, and it's been imitated since many times. So I believe that was the major contributions of Star Trek. So having redefined the genre of science fiction, I think Stanley Kubrick was the next visionary to take the genre to the next level. Unfortunately, I believe his major contribution is all at the level of visuals. Just the way he designed everything and the way the movie looked, I give it an 11 out of 10. It's very good, and like I said, you can see like every penny that was spent on the movie, you can see it on the screen. It's all there. But there are a few complaints that I have about the movie, and I'll start with those. 2001 begins with the Dawn of Man scene. It shows prehistoric mammals just foraging for food, and eventually the black monolith appears. So this is where the concept comes from, the novel The Sentinel. The concept is that aliens have left this Sentinel on Earth, and supposedly at various stages of evolution of life, they probably had a hand in progressing the evolution. The life reaches the level of mammals, and when they touch the monolith, they get some knowledge that they can use, and they can progress further. So it's an interesting concept, and I'll just leave it at that. But the problem that I have is the second level. There is a suggestion that the apes that touched the monolith learned to use bones as weapons. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is not Stanley Kubrick's original idea. It actually comes from a book called African Genesis by Robert Ardrey, published in 1961. And it is known that Kubrick read the book. The premise of the book is along the same lines, although it doesn't have a monolith and aliens, but it suggests that our primitive ancestors, the Australopiths, used the bones of the animals that they killed as weapons to kill more. Unfortunately for Kubrick, that theory has been disproven. And if you're interested, you can read it online in a documentary called Dawn of Humanity. It's on the Nova PBS website. The transcript of the documentary is there. So according to the documentary on PBS, quote, one of Robert Ardrey's greatest fans was the filmmaker Stanley Kubrick. At the time, he was planning a film based on the science fiction novel 2001: A Space Odyssey. It was to be a meditation on human technology run wild. At the beginning of the film, our ancestors discovered the first technology, weapons. Eventually, they will use them on each other. This was the dawn of humanity, imagined by Dart and Ardrey. It seems Raymond Dart's vision of our ancestors as the first killer apes, so famously portrayed by Stanley Kubrick, was wrong. So contrary to the theory that prehistoric humans were violent, the new theory is that prehistoric humans were cooperative and they formed social bonds. And it is this that moved the evolution of humans. So it's cooperation, not killing. It's unfortunate that millions of people watch 2001: A Space Odyssey believing that violence has led to the evolution of humans, whereas in reality it is the opposite. It is cooperation with other humans that has led us forward into 21st century, into the space age, into the computer age, etc. It's interesting that there are two connections between 2001 and Star Trek. The first one is that the actor Gary Lockwood, who was one of the co-stars of 2001, also acted in one of the episodes of Star Trek. The second connection is what I was talking about, was the game of chess. Now, it's known that Stanley Kubrick liked to play chess in between shots at the movie set. So he was a pretty good chess player. And he used a scene in 2001 to show that the computer HAL was smarter than the human astronauts by having them play a game of chess. And HAL tells one of the astronauts that he's about to lose the game in a couple of moves. He thinks about it and he agrees, yes, he's going to lose. So thereby showing to the audience in a very heavy-handed way that the computer is smarter than the humans. But the problem with 2001: Space Odyssey is of course that Stanley Kubrick makes the suggestion that humans are being held back by computers. If we only could just make a clean break with computers, we can then move forward to the next level of evolution, which is what the ending of the movie is about. We should give up computers and we will go to a new enlightened age, which is where the ending of the movie is, with all the white walls and all the Renaissance paintings on the walls. That's his version of moving forward. And I'd like to end with just one final observation. 2001 ends with the famous Star Child scene where supposedly humanity has evolved to this new level of a new human being. It's unclear. Is it a metaphorical star child, or is it in reality, and it's as big as a planet? But the interesting thing is there was another movie made in 1963 in Czechoslovakia called Icarus XB1. It shows humans traveling to another planet, and if one of the female astronauts is pregnant, and by the time they get to the other planet, she gives birth to a baby. In a similar way, although not so idealistic as 2001, Icarus ends in a similar way by showing a picture of the baby and actually focusing in on the baby's head, although the baby is still the size of a human baby, not the size of a planet.